As anyone that works with cars or most kinds of metal can attest to, it can be a big fight to clean up old parts. Before you can make something look like new again, or even just protect it from farther deterioration, the parts will need to be cleaned. The first step is usually to remove greasy, oily residue. Gaskets, flaking paint, and worst of all, rust should be removed. Now I say should because it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes a bit of light sanding, maybe some rust converter, or just a coat of paint is all that there is time or energy for. With cars, cleaning up dirty, rusty old parts is a seemingly endless process, and there'll always be more grinding, sanding, and wire wheeling to do. But like anything else, there are many ways to clean parts up. Some involve power tools, some involve chemicals, some involve a whole lot of man-hours, and a lot of the time a combination of various methods is necessary. One such method that I've always been enamored with myself is media blasting. Just in case somebody isn't familiar, the process is really straightforward. You take a media, classically something like sand, and blast it at a surface using compressed air. Depending on variables such as the type of media, the size of the grains, and the air pressure used, you can remove all sorts of things using this process from all sorts of parts and achieve a variety of finishes. It's been mentioned in our videos once or twice, though I don't believe it's ever actually been shown, but a handful of times I've used this very basic gravity-fed blasting gun, filled it with the cheapest hardware store play sand, and sat out in the yard making an enormous mess. But despite all sorts of difficulties, I really liked the results I was able to get. So I set out trying to find a way to get those results with fewer of the issues. The first, and probably the most significant of these issues, is that open-air sandblasting makes a mess. Sand gets absolutely everywhere. And much like Anakin, I'm not a huge fan of that. And when you're using play sand and most of the material isn't recirculating, with a little gravity-fed hopper like this, it takes more time to sift rocks out of the sand and keep filling up the gun than it does to do the actual blasting. So, to at least help alleviate those issues, something I've always wanted to set up but never was quite sure I could afford is a sandblasting cabinet. If I was going to get one, it had to meet a specific set of criteria. First, it had to be large enough that I could use it on a wide variety of parts. It also had to be small enough that I could kind of tuck it away in the corner of the garage. I also really wanted one that was top-loading instead of the more common side-loading. The main reasons being that the cabinet would be usable when tucked away in that corner, and it would have less of a tendency to dump sand on the floor every time you open that side door. And of course, perhaps the most important criteria, I needed it to be relatively inexpensive. Harbor Freight sells a cabinet that's pretty tough to beat as far as price goes, but I ended up choosing this one made by TP Tools. It's just a little bit larger than the Harbor Freight one, and it is a top loader. While the cabinet was on sale, I was able to pay just under $325 for it, including sales tax and shipping. By my standards, that is certainly not cheap, but it was the most inexpensive I could find that fit the criteria I was looking for, and I was hoping that, in the long run, the investment in a blasting cabinet would be worth it. Just a few days after ordering it, the cabinet showed up disassembled in 2 boxes. The combined weight of the shipping boxes was 105 pounds, which tells me this thing is not kidding around. It seemed like this cabinet included pretty much everything needed to get it going, including cabinet gloves, an interior light, and a blasting gun. Unfortunately, it also came with a broken viewing window. From other reviews I'd read of this cabinet, it seemed like this glass breaking and chipping isn't entirely uncommon. And it wasn't the only casualty. One of the plastic surrounds for the gloves had also been broken in presumably that same impact. This is not necessarily the best sign for parts material and longevity, but I contacted the seller and they immediately shipped out the replacement parts, no questions asked. So at least it seems like the company has good customer service and is ready to resolve issues like this. It comes in quite a few pieces and you get a large bag of screws and nuts to fasten the whole thing together. I loosely attached the fasteners and put everything together before tightening them all down. The process of assembly wasn't particularly difficult, but I really should have just waited until I could get somebody else to help with it. The cabinet is obviously large, and once it starts going together, gets kind of heavy and awkward quickly. Having a helper would have made the process much faster and easier. I also elected not to use the sealer included in the cabinet to seal the panels together until it was all assembled. I would have liked to seal the panels together as the cabinet was being assembled, but doing the job alone, I think that would have been one too many things to deal with. So I ended up assembling it, then once it was together, tightening down all the fasteners, then using the included sealant, giving the inside of the cabinet a thorough coating. The cabinet also included foam strips of insulation for the lid. I went ahead and installed these, although, as we'll get to in a little bit, I regretted it later. The entire assembly, including the sealing and the foam strip installation, took around 4 hours. With 2 people, it could probably be done in 2 or less. It really is a straightforward assembly. And with the cabinet assembled, we'll push it into the corner of the garage where I had planned for it to live. And here's the cabinet right after that initial assembly. This switch on the side turns on the LED light built into the cabinet. And other than my ugly sealing job, at this point I was pretty happy with the cabinet. Most of it feels very sturdy, and it's a decent sized work area. If it had just 6 or 10 inches more width, it would be the perfect size. But I think it's large enough for almost anything I would want to blast that would fit in any kind of cabinet. But immediately after assembling it, I started tweaking some things about the cabinet. First off, that light. It seems fine, but it's really not all that bright. And since it's only half of the width of the cabinet, it doesn't do the best job at lighting up that right side. I had a few of these lights sitting around that I had gotten on sale for $10 each a while back. They're a little bit too long to fit in the case when assembled, but I figured I could take just the LED tube part out of it and install that in the blasting cabinet. So we'll go ahead and disassemble the light and remove the end caps. Here's what that LED light strip inside of the tube looks like if you were curious. Only the housing on the left side of the tube has any electrical components in it. We'll leave that on for the moment and test fit the whole thing in the cabinet. It's a good fit, in fact it's almost exactly the right width. And since the plastic tube housing is already fairly frosted, hopefully the amount of light won't diminish over time as it gets hit with stray blasting material. But what I don't trust inside the cabinet are the electrical components. So we'll snip the 2 little feed wires that are actually the ones powering the LEDs. Then we can extend those wires and add a connector into the mix. We'll feed the wires into the control box, plug it in, and give it a test. Now we have the wiring for both lights passing through the same bulkhead connector in the side of the cabinet. And it's immediately obvious that the cabinet is lit up much better than before. So the wiring is done, but how are we going to close up this tube and protect it? My first thought was to use one of these caps from a spray can for each side. But because of the reinforcing ribs on the inside of the caps, it seemed like it was going to be more trouble than it was worth, and I decided to just use some tape to close the light up. 2 layers sealing both ends should be enough to keep out at least the vast majority of particles. I couldn't really come up with an easier way to mount it, so I ended up drilling 4 holes in the top of the cabinet and just using zip ties to hold that light up. I also notched the side of the existing switch box on the side of the cabinet so that both wires could feed through it. And now that the cabinet is lit up nicely, there was another crucial modification I wanted to make. I really wanted this cabinet mobile, and for that I wanted to mount it on wheels. The manufacturer actually sells a kit to do just this, but with the price tag of over $100, I just couldn't justify it. I also wanted to leave the front of the cabinet open so that it would be possible to stand directly up against it or even slide something partway underneath it. With the cabinet on the ground, the legs feel solid enough, but I don't think I would trust them for rolling it around. So in order to brace all of those together, we'll break out the 2x4s. We used the chop saw to do some creative notching on these 2x4s so that they would sit in flush with the stamped steel legs of the cabinet. Then we attached the boards to each other and to the cabinet legs with a handful of screws. And now we can attach the wheels. These are just standard little $3 locking casters from the hardware store. We attach these using screws through the steel base of each leg and the boards. Once they were all on, we realized the cabinet wasn't quite sitting flat anymore. First, we cut out some sheet steel shims, but they weren't quite thick enough. So we used this little scrap piece of wood to space out one of the wheels and have the cabinet sit perfectly flat on this part of the floor. I say this part of the floor because it isn't perfectly flat everywhere, but I think that probably has to do more with the floor than the layout of these wheels. And here we go. We are finally in business with our blasting cabinet. The whole thing is assembled and the basic modifications I had planned were complete. It is mobile, it is bright, and it is ready to use. And we had gotten our replacement parts, so the new sheet of glass and the gloves were fully installed. At some point I'd like to redo the wiring for the light as well as add a ground connection for the cabinet to help dissipate static electricity, but for now this will do. And we were ready to test out the cabinet. Well, until I decided that the door didn't seal well enough. I had tried several different combinations and stack-ups of the foam seals that came with the cabinet, but just judging on how much light was visible through the seams, I was not able to get a good seal. I decided to remove the very thin foam seals and replace them with something a little bit taller. Part of the problem is that the steel that the door is made out of is just a little bit too thin, so the door has some flex to it. I figured a taller, squishier seal would do a better job. But before we can install any of that, we have to get these foam seals back off. And of course, they wouldn't come off in one piece and turned into a sticky mess. It took 2 hours of heat guns, scraping, solvents, and some pretty nasty blisters to get the seals off and the surfaces cleaned up. But eventually we got the foam seals off, and here are the rubber seals that we're going to use. We applied that in 4 separate strips to the body of the cabinet, and with those the door seal is much, much better. And once you latch it down, it squishes the seals really positively. There's still a dot or two where light is visible between the seams, but it's not bad at all. And now that it has been sealed, we can actually fill the cabinet up with media. A relatively cheap option that I wanted to start with was this glass bead from Harbor Freight. Glass bead leaves a really nice surface finish and is safe for softer metals like aluminum. So we'll get this opened up and ready to pour in. Only this doesn't appear to be glass bead at all. This just looks like crushed glass. Which I guess explains the price, but it is not what I was looking for. So I don't know if all the glass bead Harbor Freight sells is the same supplier, but I don't think this stuff is actually glass bead. Still, what the heck, we'll give it a try. Pouring media in and watching it drain through the top grate is one of the best parts. It's strangely satisfying, you know? And that is what 50 pounds of media looks like in this cabinet. So, finally, the cabinet is all together, except we still haven't addressed all of the issues that I was having with open air sandblasting. And quite simply, that's because media blasting uses a lot of pressurized air. My current arsenal consists of 2 air compressors. This old red Porter Cable one I bought off of Craigslist years and years ago, and this Campbell Hausfeld air compressor that was given to me and we fixed in a previous video. I also got this external air tank on Craigslist, which adds a bit more capacity. For its size, that Campbell Hausfeld air compressor is actually pretty quick, but it's a bit of a rusty problem child, and sometimes it still likes to trip breakers, so it's a tricky one to rely on. And due to the hassle of carrying these units around, their somewhat unreliable nature, and the noise, I end up very rarely using air tools, even when sometimes they would be superior to my other options. So this seems like as good an excuse as any to actually get a decent air compressor. I hunted around for a used one, but the only things in my price range were old, rusty, or just Harbor Freight units. The Harbor Freight ones are definitely inexpensive, and I've heard some decent things about the newer compressors they offer, but I ended up deciding to spend a little bit more and get a model that is specifically advertised as being quiet. This is the Cobalt 26-gallon Quiet Tech air compressor. When I drove all the way over to the store to pick it up, I brought the most appropriate vehicle possible. Who says a coupe can't also be a utility vehicle? The compressor is 130 pounds and it is a tight fit, but by taking out the T-top, it did fit in the 91 Firebird. Didn't even have to take it out of the box. And after driving back on local roads and avoiding right-hand turns, we got the air compressor safely home. So I'll slide that on out of the car just like your friend after a long night of white wine spritzers, get the air compressor out of the box and set up. I have to admit, the pointy corner of the box did damage the seat in the car a little bit, but it wasn't entirely unexpected and it's not like the seats are in good shape anyway. The first thing I did with the air compressor was let it run for 20 minutes with the drain valve open to break it in. There are some different opinions online about whether or not this is necessary with modern oil-less air compressors, and the instructions for this unit didn't mention it, but I figured it couldn't hurt and better safe than sorry. After that break-in run, both of the air filters had rattled loose, so I put some Teflon tape on them and tightened them down. There was another reviewer of this air compressor who had mentioned it, so I wasn't particularly surprised. It seems like they probably just don't tighten down the filters quite enough at the factory. Once the break-in was finished and the drain valve was closed, the air compressor motor wouldn't restart if the tank was holding pressure. I tested the unloader valve, which appears to be working properly, but as it turns out, this air compressor only works plugged directly into the wall. It seems that not a single extension cord that I own is up to the task of running it. At the moment it is a little impractical, but once you plug it straight into the wall, the air compressor works great. And it lives up to its name. It really is the quietest I have ever heard. It certainly isn't silent or anything, but as far as air compressors go, it's not bad at all. And since it's on wheels, even though it's much bigger and heavier than the other compressors, in most cases this one is easier to move around. So this will be a lot easier to use and work much better for other tasks, but the reason we're talking about it in this video is because of its use with the blasting cabinet. And speaking of the cabinet, we have that 5-gallon bucket underneath it because that trapdoor at the bottom of the cabinet does leak a little bit. It's not really surprising since it has those same foam seals on it, but if you move the cabinet around or even just leave it sitting there, it does kind of slowly drain out. In fact, it's such a small amount, I don't think it's worth doing anything about it, and that bucket will keep it from piling up or getting spread around. So we've got our cabinet, our air compressor, and our media. It is time for a first test. You can see we've rolled the cabinet out of the corner, partly because I expect without any kind of dust collection or filtration system, this is gonna make a bit of a mess. Certainly nowhere near the mess of open air media blasting, but I was anticipating that some amount of that glass would escape from the cabinet. So, what should our first test be? Well, we're currently working on an engine rebuild, and I was able to source these factory aluminum valve covers for it, but they're not looking so hot. There's half a layer of paint and just general dust and grime on these covers. Here they are getting a final rinse after they have been scrubbed clean with degreaser. Before we throw these in the cabinet, I do need to mention the possibility of getting glass or sand grit inside of the engine when these go back on. I simply cannot say that there is a 0% chance of that happening, especially with the steel baffles on the inside. As a lot of the things are on this channel, this is a bit of an experiment to see what I can and can't get away with. After we blast these, we'll rinse and scrub and scrub and rinse and scrub and rinse and scrub and scrub and rinse these just to make sure they're as clean as I can possibly get them. We're using that new air compressor to blast the water off of these and even start blasting off some of that paint. This is one of the main reasons I wanted a quiet, large capacity air compressor that I can just wheel out and use quickly. It makes drying off and cleaning off parts so much easier. And now that they've been dried, it's time to put these in the blasting cabinet and take it for its maiden voyage. The glare on the glass from being outside during the day does make things a little bit trickier to see. But with both lights in the cabinet turned on, they're enough that it's possible to see what we're doing. You can see that I'm wearing a respirator. This was mostly because I was concerned about how much glass and silica and paint was going to be blowing out the back of the cabinet. It seemed like I might as well not be breathing all of that in. Unfortunately, after around 8 minutes of solid blasting, the air compressor started to run out of steam. I knew that the advertised 4.5 CFM at 90 psi was a bit low for a blasting setup. But without stepping outside of my price range, which I had already overextended by this point, this was pretty on par with the best I'd be able to do. The duty cycle is around 8 minutes of blasting and 5 minutes of build-up time. Running constantly in warm weather, the air compressor does heat up a fair bit, so I did let it cool down every once in a while. I ended up using a little box fan to blow air over it, and that little bit of airflow did the trick. With the fan, it would just get warm to the touch. And after fiddling around with everything and trying to get used to this sandblast cabinet, here are the valve covers. The one with the rougher finish was the first one where I was still trying to figure out distances and angles for the gun. The surface finish doesn't have to be perfect since the plan is to paint these. But boy, they look a heck of a lot better than they did, and this seems like a good start for our cabinet setup. But my concerns about the dust were not unwarranted. There are blasting cabinet specific dust collectors, and I would love to end up with one of those in the future, but it was just a little bit too much money for now. So here's the setup that I ended up with. We have a 3.5 horsepower shop vac, which is honestly a little bit too small for the size of this cabinet, and this dust stopper dust collector that snaps onto the top of a 5-gallon bucket and prevents a lot of the media from working its way into the vacuum. The shop vacuum was $30, and I kinda needed one anyway, so I don't feel too bad about that purchase. And the dust stopper was $40, which considering the construction seems a bit high, but I guess you're paying for the design. And it is a pretty neat design. The shop vacuum attaches to this with its hose, and then we'll attach another hose that was included with the dust stopper between it and the blast cabinet. Only this shop vacuum uses a 1 7/8 inch hose, and the dust stopper wants a 2.5. But I have an idea on how we can make this work. And it involves a lot of tape. The shop vac came with a few of these extensions for its hose, so I think we can spare one. I cut the side that fits onto the hose about 3 inches from the end of the extension. Then we just have to build up the outer diameter of this to 2.5 inches. First, I laid down a base layer of vinyl tape, then built it up with a not insignificant amount of cheap cloth duct tape. Just in case we want to in the future, that base layer of vinyl tape will make it possible to remove the duct tape without a sticky mess. And once we've built up enough of it, we have a perfect fit for that 2.5 inch elbow. Then for some extra sealing confidence, we'll wrap the outside of the whole thing with more vinyl electrical tape. And there you have it. There is our 2.5 inch to 1 7/8 inch adapter. So now we can pop that back onto the top of the dust stopper and hook our shop vac hose right up to it. Then we'll run the short extension hose from the dust collector up to the blasting cabinet. This is a 2.5 inch fitting, but the hose fits a little bit loosely in it, but just one wrap of that vinyl tape made everything seat nicely. So there you go, there is our shop vacuum dust collector setup. The volume of the shop vac certainly makes the volume of the air compressor less important, but I think this will do a good job and help keep the air inside the blast cabinet clear, as well as keep the media from spreading all over the floor behind it. To further complicate our setup, we also stuck that blue 7-gallon air tank between the compressor and the cabinet. Adding that air tank gives us approximately 10 minutes of solid use time for the blasting cabinet. And along with that, we're using 2 moisture filters. Although for our humid Maryland weather, they're not quite enough, and moisture does eventually work its way all the way to the gun. After an hour or two of use, we start having some line clog issues, so I cut out this little piece of rubber and stuck it to the inside of the cabinet, and when I notice a flow problem, I can just press the nozzle of the gun up to this rubber piece, pull the trigger, and it'll blast all that air pressure through the suction hose to clear it out. It seems like with this current setup, I can get 3 or 4 hours of use out of the cabinet before this gets too annoying. And after probably 2 hours of solid runtime, this is how much dust was collected in our 5-gallon bucket. It's a significant amount, and what's even more significant is that there was basically nothing in the shop vac. For a vacuum that is clearly smaller than what's intended to be used with this dust collector, it still works really well. This dust collector should also be great for picking up other fine materials without clogging up the shop vacuum filter. And here are some of the parts that we were able to clean up on our first day with our full setup. I have to say, I'm really happy with the results. Yeah, the setup is still kinda complicated, and it ended up costing more than I had hoped it would, but now we have several new tools in our arsenal. For us, this cabinet isn't really an everyday use item, but there will definitely be times when it's worth setting up. And like anything else we use, it's likely it will be farther modified and hopefully improved in the future. This dust collector setup works really well, but it is a bit cumbersome and loud. While blasting, the air stays fairly clear, though I think it could be better. But it does keep the cabinet from blowing media out of the back. I also ended up sticking another T-fitting on this blue air tank, which lets me hook up 2 air compressors, and with the red Porter cable compressor running alongside the Cobalt, the pair can keep up with the airflow demands of the blast cabinet. I still probably wouldn't run it for more than a half hour at a time to give everything a chance to cool down, and because it's still an awkward position standing hunched over the cabinet. I might end up putting bigger wheels on it because, for my height, I wish it was a few inches taller. But it seems like a very effective setup, and I'm glad to finally have it. The only problem is, now I have even less excuses for putting rusty parts back onto the cars.